Hey, just working hard so I can please you.
Is that really the intro we're going with? Really?
Really?
Remember that first intro? Remember how cute that was? Well, that was then. This is now. And people can change, you know?
That was literally 2 weeks ago.
Well, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. If you're here, you've probably checked out the part 1 video in this tutorial series already, and if you're anything like me, it took no time at all to become obsessed with using Rahituber. And if you're new here and you're confused about what the heck a Rahituber even is, I'm gonna channel Anime Jesus from the recent art trend on Twitter and tell you,
Now is not the time for you, my child. Go back to your old timeline.
I mean, the level 1 video.
Ain't no way this MF just compared themselves to Jesus in a Rahituber video.
For just a quick recap though, Rahituber is a PNGtuber software that has recently been gaining attention due to how lightweight and customizable it is. My name is Kippy Cringe Devil. I make a bunch of stuff in Rahituber, and this is my tutorial series where I really try to teach you in depth everything I've learned about Rahituber so far. The series aims to show you from start to finish what I would do to bring this model, this chibi model, to life. And I've split it up into 3 episodes, each one representing a different level of difficulty for the PNGtuber. Level 1 went over all of the fundamentals using a 1-layer PNGtuber as the example. In this episode, episode 2, is probably going to end up being the longest because we get really into the nitty-gritty of Rahituber's physics. Level 3 will be where I get into the mouse tracking techniques that I've been using, as well as any other more complicated, more maybe confusing technique that I've taught myself. My mouse tracking is set up with the physics in mind. It's very tied and very intentionally made to work with the physics in a certain way. So we have to start there. This video ended up even longer than the last one. I think it's going to be like twice as long, maybe like 2.5 hours, I don't know. So I definitely encourage you to take it in parts if you want, or, you know, watch at 2 times speed and use the chapters to get to the part that you want specifically. But for those of you who watched the first and you've been waiting for this one to take your PNGtuber all the way through the steps, they are kind of organized in a linear-ish fashion. So each concept that I'm teaching builds upon the stuff that I've already covered in level 1 and throughout this video. I think I'm going to separate some of the more complicated, like deep dive material. I think it'll be really cool to know and keep in mind as you're setting up your stuff, but it's kind of overly complicated for a lot of the PNGtuber stuff you might want to do. And I don't want you to worry yourself thinking, oh my god, I have to know all this. No. It should be pretty evident which parts in my explanation are the parts that like you need to know and which parts are kind of extra knowledge for fancier stuff if you want to do it later. But I'm new to this explaining thing, so if I do manage to get you lost, then I'm sorry. You can always ask me for help and extra clarification on socials. And this is a secret I'm hiding here. I haven't told anybody yet. I might be releasing some test models. I deleted most of them though, so I'd have to rig it again. I'm so excited to finally be here. Please excuse any scuff throughout because I did record my tutorials for this video in different sessions, but a lot of the especially advanced topics I've recorded very recently for you so I can give my most up-to-date explanations. Okay students, pick up your 1-layer PNGtuber models from level 1 if you've got them, and prepare to tear them apart piece by piece so you can put them back together again.
Separated.
We're going to start by talking about how to create our own layers for Rahituber. Our goal is to end up with the artwork split into PNG files with transparent backgrounds to be able to load them into Rahituber for our manipulation. If you're hoping to use PNGtuber art that you're getting commissioned by someone else, Ask your artist if they can either provide you with separated layers as PNG files in a folder or a file with separated layers already, such as a PSD or something like that, that you can then export yourself. Keep in mind the original complexity of the art you paid for as well. If your artist usually makes art in PNGtuber Plus or for PNGtuber Plus, they will already be pretty well versed in separating the art, as that software also uses individual layers to animate. And on the other hand, if you're getting art made for something like VODs or Fujitech, where the art is merged to begin with, your artist might not be able to split those layers for you. In any case, if it wasn't part of the original package that you paid for, your artist might want to charge an extra fee for splitting the layers or giving you the working files to split it yourself. If you have permission from the original artist and access to a drawing program, you can take the merged artwork and separate the layers yourself. This is actually what I'll be doing in this portion of the video, as I like to start with merged artwork. I just find it easier because of the way that I paint. Some artists might have it in their terms of use that they're not okay with their artwork being edited. Communication is key, so please do always ask if you aren't sure whether they'd be okay with you or another artist editing the artwork to be rigged in Rahituber. If you're starting out fresh and would like to ask an artist to make artwork for Rahituber rigging specifically, all you need to tell them is to make sure that you have access to separated layers as PNG files. It'll probably be easiest for you to get the files back in PNG format, but I will be quickly touching on a quick and easy way to export all layers at once as PNG if you are given the working file or PSD. Another note for yourself or your artist is that the original art doesn't need to be at a specific size in order to work. Rahituber can handle basically as much as your GPU memory can handle. Personally, I haven't gone above 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels. You can go bigger or smaller than that. It shouldn't impact the performance of Rahituber too much. You can export them however you want. You could bring out each layer, crop it, and have the layer's PNG file only be the size of the drawing. But then you'll see later that when loading your files into Rahituber, you'll need to adjust the positions of all your layers under transform on each layer in order to get them in the right spot again. Ensuring that all the files are saved at the same size and aspect ratio will save you that step. It is a little bit too difficult to explain the pros and cons of cropping down your layers versus keeping them at the original size without touching on physics a little bit. I have gone ahead and made a copy of this face layer here, and this one is cropped. Compared to the original face layer, we'll watch the big box move. You see that box? That's the full size of the original artwork, including all of the negative space around it. So when I loaded everything in, that had got put right where it's supposed to be, versus if I put the new layer back in its default position, you can see that it loads in right there, and I would have to move it manually. When it comes to certain physics, especially the ones that have to do with the pivot point and the ignore pivot section, which we'll get into later, some of these physics would apply to the entire layer. So if you have a layer with a whole bunch of extra negative space, the way that the visible part of the layer is affected is going to look different. So all that really means is that you might be able to have a better time more directly seeing how your physics affect the layer versus, if this head was positioned over here on the layer versus over here on the layer, I might get different looks. And in that case, you can still get what you want. You just have to be more picky with how you move the pivot point and things like weight direction and stuff, which is none of that's going to make sense to you yet. But just in case, I'm going to mention it now. Generally speaking, the only layers you have to worry about separating are any layers that you eventually want to have moving or being able to be turned on and off in Rahituber. The amount of separated layers you want and which layers you want separated depends on how much control you want to have later over the movement of your model. For setups along the simpler end of the spectrum, maybe you only want the face details separated from the rest of the body so you can toggle different expressions, or perhaps you only want the head separated from the body to be able to add a little bit of a bobblehead effect while the rest of the body stays merged. Those are just two examples of simpler layer separation. In more advanced setups like my full 2.0 model and this chibi model, I saved many of my layers as separate files, even a little bit excessively, because I wanted the freedom to be able to make many different parts of the model move separately. You can find tons of tutorials out there for how to draw or split existing art into layers. It might be helpful to check out art tutorials for VTuber are because you can pretty much use the exact same layer setup as one of those models, just probably simplified down a whole lot unless you didn't want to simplify it down a whole lot. For me, having done some very scuffed experiments with Live 2D in the past, I did have a bit of an understanding of how those layers work, and it helped me in this process. This level of layer separation was pretty minimal for the body parts right now, but much more complex when we got to the hair and the eyes. I knew that the hair was something I wanted to have cut up into many parts because the individual movements of hair layers would help sell the more complex 3D-ish effects I wanted to pull off with mouse tracking layer. The eyes were set up in a particularly interesting way. I specifically set it up to be able to do funny stuff with the eyes using mouse tracking later. For this setup, I needed to separate the eye whites, irises, eyelashes, and then I had an extra layer that I called eyes mask that lives above the eye whites and below the eyelashes. The eye mask layer was a direct copy-paste of the face layer below, shaped to be just around the eyes like a mask and with the eye whites area removed. Its purpose is to create a large area around the eyes that will prevent the irises from poking out as they move around, but will match the face layer below. I separated both irises to have an iris left and an iris right because I anticipated that I would want to be moving them separately later for various effects. So whether you're cutting existing artwork or making new artwork, you want to think about having any overlapping layers be filled in underneath the layers that are overlapping it. This is because if we want to move stuff around on the model later with physics or motion or mouse tracking, whatever, we don't want to see gaps all the way through to the background. So you can see a couple examples in this section where I filled in the head, I filled in the back of the hair, and I'm filling in the neck here. Those are all technically parts you won't see in the merged artwork or when the model is still, but when I'm moving it, you can see the benefit here because I can move the head freely, I can move it up, and even though the neck ends up being hidden by the face most of the time at the top, I filled in enough up there that I'm not worried about the head looking like it's detaching. The amount that you fill in the layers underneath overlapping ones kind of is up to you. It'll just be sometimes the limiting factor in how much you can move that layer eventually when we're rigging stuff later. So what happens when we want lighting or shadow layers on our model? Maybe we have some multiply or overlay layers in the original files. Well, Rahituber has something kind of similar, and I want to get into blend modes later, but I felt like it fit in here. So you can get similar kind of effects using the blend mode setting in Rahituber, with the modes being based on the types of blend modes you'd get in an art program. I'm using these spotlights as an example. You can set them to any blend mode, and then you can play with the tint setting to change the tint or the opacity of that layer. And on top of that, the layer acts like any other layer, so we can add individual motion and have it move on its own, or we can chain it with the motion inherit chain and have the lighting layer inherit movement from the parent that you gave it, as well as any other layer that came before it in the chain. Note that if you have transparency enabled and the UI is hidden, then these layers appear to clip to the whole model. If you want a layer to clip just like that without having a blend mode, if you want the art to look like it originally did in your program, you can use the clip to backdrop. I want to cover this more in depth in level 3, but you can play with these now to try to see if you can get similar lighting effects to what you envisioned. When all of my layers were separated and properly named, I saved my file as a PSD and brought it over to Krita. Krita is free and it comes with this handy export layers tool. By adjusting the settings, clicking the button, and waiting a couple seconds, you can easily export all of the layers with their names and at the original size of your file, which keeps all of the layers saved as being in the original position you put them in.
Well, where's the rest of me? It isn't as though I haven't lived up to my contract, goodness knows. And goodness knows it isn't as though I haven't kept myself trim, goodness knows. I've done that.
So, we have our artwork separated into layers. Now what? Hi, it's VoiceOver Kip again. So I'm using the footage from the VOD where we set up all of our layers because the current model that I've been using to demonstrate with is still using the same layers, so all of this is exactly the same, but the process was a little bit lengthy, so I had to speed it up a whole bunch. We'll just use this to summarize the process and give an overview about multiple layer setup. We'll recall the first part of the video where we set up our avatar as just a single layer. We'll be following that same workflow, except this time we're adding each PNG we have saved as an individual layer in Rahituber. I recommend placing the folder with your layers in the /Rahituber win folder for easy access. We talked a little bit about this in the simple setup, but normally when you add a new layer, you see all of the options that come with the default layer, unless you have the toggle on for create minimal layers. What I actually did in this setup, and you can kind of see it in the VOD, is instead of clicking the add layer button, and this is the legacy UI you're seeing by the way, I had the first layer with all of the motion settings turned off, and then just kept duplicating that layer. It did work, but if I did it again, I would probably just turn on create minimal layer setting in the advanced menu like we did at the very start with that first model. The order of the layers in the UI on the left will be important, as whichever is on top of the list will appear on top of your model. You can change the position of the layer by clicking and dragging, or by using the up and down arrows that we can see in the icons for each layer. What I'm doing here at this point in the video is dragging these layers up into this body folder. Organizing your layers into folders is not only going to help things look neat, but will make things easier when you're doing some advanced stuff with states later, as we'll go over together in the advanced state setup section of the video. When setting up this chibi model for stream, I was pretty diligent about using these folders, but in my main setup, I hardly have any folders at all, and it's a huge fucking mess.
It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God.
Rahituber's physics, or motion inherit settings, could easily be one of the more intimidating parts of Rahituber to learn. When you're brand new to the software and looking at an especially complex setup like this one, your first thought might just be, what the f***? How the f***? The tooltips in Rahituber, as always, as well as Rahi's own explanations throughout the Rahituber documentation, a lot of it you can find in the updates and forum sections. They do a good job of summarizing what is happening, but throughout my journey working in Rahituber myself, I would end up with some questions about why certain interactions weren't behaving the way I expected them to, and I only learned the answers through talking to Rahi myself. So in this rather beefy section of the video, I attempt to answer some of those questions I used to have. Questions like, why isn't my drag doing anything? Why is this layer rotating more than that layer? I want this bitch layer bouncy. Why isn't it bouncy?
Watch your profanity.
I definitely might have made some mistakes in my understanding of how it really works, since I'm not an animator or a developer at all, but I did try to bug Rahi for their explanation for parts that I didn't quite get yet. I hope that I can answer some of your questions here if you have them, or if not, that I can at least do a decent job showing you how much possibility there is when it comes to chaining physics and movements for a super cool, complex avatar setup. We'll still be using my chibi tutorial PNGtuber for this, so all of my examples are based around that, but all of this information should still apply no matter what kind of setup you end up with. So here we go. Sorry in advance for anything that's a little bit dry or rambly.
Jingle, jingle, pay attention, pay attention. I said your favorite word, the back rooms. Okay, the back rooms. Dingle, dangle, dingle, dangle. Okay, before that was a thing.
So at this point, if you're following along and you've just finished setting up a model with all your separated layers but nothing else, you'll either have a bunch of layers not moving at all if you added layers with the create minimal layers toggle on, or all of your layers are moving but they're all moving separately. This is because we haven't touched the motion inherit settings for any of our layers yet. The motion inherit tab is the most important part of each layer when it comes to adding physics. Some terms that I often use when talking about the relationship between the layer inheriting the motion and the layer being inherited from are parent and child, or the whole setup as the parent-child hierarchy. In this case, the parent refers to the layer our current layer wants to inherit motion from, the layer that we choose in this dropdown. The child or children refers to the layer or layers that inherit motion from that parent. When I'm using the term parent-child hierarchy, what I mean is that there's a chain where a parent layer is passing on motions to a child, which then passes on to another child, which then passes to another child, etc. The inheritance graph, you might have noticed the button in your UI by now, is a great new button we've had given to us in the 13.4 update of Rahituber. All it does when you press it on any layer that has a motion inherit parent set is show you the chain of parents before it. The current layer is highlighted in pink, and any hidden layers are grayed out. This is useful anytime you're playing with motion inherit physics and you find yourself trying to interrogate your layers. Why the hell are you even doing that? Who are your parents? Who raised you? Now you can see, in fact, who is their parent, so you can hunt them down later and adjust the settings accordingly. So what we do now is in any child layers, we can go into the motion inherit, and as soon as we have a parent set, we get access to these settings here. So there's delay, drag, spring, distance limit, and rotation effect. And I will explain what each one means. In the tutorial VOD, we had help from Rahi with understanding what these are actually supposed to be doing. The way that I explain things in words sometimes doesn't make the most sense. So as always, I recommend just playing with all of these settings yourself and seeing how it affects the model. I'll share some of my tips and thoughts on what these do and what you could do with it as we go. There's also these toggles down here. The hide with parent might be important. If you have this toggled on, then if I went and hid the shoes, now we don't see the legs. It looks like the other children that I have set don't have that setting toggled. We went pretty in depth with individual motion when we did our first simpler model, but the toggle to open the menu is at the very bottom of motion inherit, and that's where you'll find settings for talking, idle, and constant motion. If we go into legs, we can start messing around with these, and pretty much as soon as you start playing with these sliders, you start to see some different effects happening to the legs and every other layer in the motion inherit chain after the legs. The delay, this is the time before this layer follows the parent's motion. So pretty straightforward and a lot easier to tell when you start to turn it up. Basically, this current layer will not budge at all, won't apply any motion or physics, I believe, until this time has passed. So if we have it set to 0.50 seconds, that's a half of a second before we follow this shoes movement. And then after that time passes, it's doing the exact same motion that the parent is. It's moving just that much, in this case, like 100 or whatever we have it set to. So on their legs. If we turn up this delay, we're not moving that layer at all until this delay has passed. And you'll notice all of the other layers are following the leg right now. That's because of the way that I have the chain set up. All of the physics you set on those parent layers will affect all of the children. So again, when we start to set this delay, all of the layers that are inheriting motion down from the legs are also delayed the same amount. They're delayed the same amount right now because none of the other children have their own settings yet. But as we start to get into the children, we can start to adjust this. If I, added a delay to the hoodie, it's following the original delay of the legs and then adding its own delay after that. So if we watch the shoes move first, then the legs, then the hoodie. Obviously that looks silly right now, but that's the base principles of how something like the delay works. Next up, we've got drag. And at first glance, it might look like it's doing something pretty close to what the delay does. In a way, yes, but it is very different. When we discussed delay just now, we talked about how the layer with the delay, the child, won't move at all until the delay time, whatever we set, passes. And then all of the inherited motion and the physics will apply. On the other hand, drag just makes the layer slower to reach the target position. The higher the drag, the slower that movement is. If you look closely at a layer that only has drag and no delay, you can see that the child layer with the physics does start moving at the same time as the parent layer. It's just that the higher we turn up the drag, the slower that movement is. We can see drag physics applying to a layer as long as there's something making that layer's position stray away from the parent's position. Without touching any other physics settings, we do see an effect here because we don't have a distance limit set. It's set to -1, which means no limit. You might be sitting there like, huh? What? I don't get it. Don't worry, there's a section about distance limit later because the same rule applies to spring as well, and messing with the distance limit has an effect on all the other kinds of physics too. But yes, if you're trying to use drag and you're not seeing an effect at all yet, that could be because you have a distance limit set to 0. While I was doing some testing stuff, in fact, today even, I found some interesting things about the drag physics, as well as every other kind of physics that I didn't know about before and didn't originally include in my explanations here. However, I think it makes sense to cover those things together in the section of the video where I'm talking about how some of the physics interact with each other, rather than putting it right here where we're talking about kind of like isolated drag effects. So if you're watching these individual physics explanations and you're feeling like I didn't really explain everything, chances are it's going to come up in another section of the video. If I'm organized, it'll all be in one section at the end where it's like something about how motion combines with the physics, something like that. I don't know how I'm labeling them yet. Anyway, yeah, so drag isn't actually something I often use by itself. It's often something I combine with spring, especially. So we're going to get right into that explanation next. So here we are with spring. So spring is one of the effects where I feel like it makes more sense to watch what's happening visually versus like hearing me explain it in words, because my words might overcomplicate it a little bit. But to start, the Rahituber tooltip says that spring is going to make the layer slower to change direction. So as long as your layer is allowed to move separately from the parent layer, say if you have the distance limit of -1, we talked about this a little bit in drag, with only spring on the layer, your layer is going to start moving along with the parent layer, basically at the same time and same speed, but it'll take a bit of extra time to settle into the final position. And in that time, it'll kind of go back and forth between being slightly ahead of the final position and slightly behind the final position, almost like it can't decide to settle down or not. That's how you get the kind of boing, 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 boing. What actually happens when we turn it up higher is that time that it takes to settle down increases, which will both make the bouncing, the spring effect, look like it's happening slower, and the layer will appear to move more in the back and forth motion the the higher the spring as well. I want to put some asterisks on this because this does change depending on what other physics you're giving the layer. I fear I may have made it sound like spring is specifically for like bouncing up and down. That is not the case. So if your layer with spring on it is inheriting motion that makes it move side to side, the layer will appear to move, side to side before settling into the end position. The hair layers on this model are a good example of a high spring amount. Notice how when I'm moving them, there are other physics, but that swinging back and forth that happens as I move the head around is thanks to spring mostly. Spring adds a lot of life and movement to a lot of the other physics effects, so I tend to use it a lot. It works along with drag and rotation and squash and stretch, and for that reason it's very cool. And thankfully I think that it's the easiest to kind of understand just by looking at it. The distance limit is important. When we change this, we'll see how it affects things right away. But this number is meant to limit how far the layer can stray from the parent's position. It's set by default to -1, which means there's no limit. I think we should probably show, I didn't realize the layer bounds weren't showing. This is our pivot point here, which we can kind of use right now as a visual indicator of how much and how the layer is moving. I'm going to adjust where the shoe's pivot point is so we can see this a little bit better. We can look at the 2 pivot points to be able to see more clearly. Right now, they're moving the exact same amount. When we turn the spring up, for example, now we can clearly see, looking at those pivot points, the current layer's position obviously is straying away from the parent's position. And we can see that clearly by looking at the pivot points down there. As soon as we change this to something like 0 and make it so that there is no distance limit, we don't see that spring effect anymore. We don't see it because these settings, drag and spring, don't really apply unless there's something telling the current layer to move separately from the parent layer. So there's nothing right now to say, hey, this layer is moving separately, so now physics need to apply. If we turn up the drag and try to use that, we also don't see a drag effect happening. If we add a delay, we still don't see that drag and spring applying because that distance limit is 0. So the layer, even though we see it moving separately, it's a little bit different because the layer is moving the same amount just at a different time because of the delay. If we start to turn up this distance limit, we can start to see our drag and spring come into play again.
I'll turn down the drag and spring so you can see it a little bit better. Or sorry, I'll turn down the drag, turn up the spring because that's a easy visual indicator that's working.
As we go above 0, this distance away from the original layers, or from the parent's position, we do see that spring come into play. Since we now have something telling a layer that it's allowed to move farther away from the parent. As we start to get really small distance limits, we get this kind of jerky thing, and that's because it's hitting that distance limit with these spring settings. When we have no limit or a really high limit, you can see how far we actually go with the spring as we're speaking. It's going to try to go that far still, but when it hits this distance limit, if it's too small, it just tries to snap back to the original position, which looks a little bit janky. So honestly, I don't mess with the settings too much beyond going either -1 or 0, depending on what I need. The rotation effect is one of the physics effects I have really tried to understand well. I actually didn't really get what was going on until I started working on this tutorial series. Previously, the way I used the rotation effect on my main model was pretty much completely guesswork. I could adjust the physics and pivot point settings until my eyeballs told me that it looked good, but could not explain what was going on. There's nothing wrong with figuring out your physics that way. In fact, I still encourage anyone I talk to about Rahituber to try things out in their setups and watch what happens. But I can't lie, brushing up on my own understanding has helped a ton in everything that I'm doing. So I want to do my best to pass on what I've learned to you. Don't take my word as gospel though, because I'm still experimenting and learning myself. The best example of how I've used rotation would probably be this dancey version of the chibi cringe devil model. You can see rotation happening in multiple places on the model to varying degrees and in different directions. Since everything is chained together, rotation coming from the base layers interacts with the rest of the physics on the model, and then adding more rotation on the other layers creates this kind of cool chained together I like that game. This cool effect with rotation happening in different directions. So when you add rotation to a layer with no other physics applied to it, you won't see anything happening yet. To have a visible rotation effect, you need to set up 2 extra things in the layer. First, you will need to get the pivot point of the layer off of the layer center. We talked about the pivot point a little bit in level 1, and I'll be elaborating on the importance of the pivot point in its own section later, kind of. More so talking about the ignore pivot setting. But anyway, the most important thing to note is that the pivot point is the point the layer will rotate around. Where you actually want the pivot point is going to be dependent on what the object pictured actually is, and to figure that out, you'll need to picture how that object would move in real life. For example, on a character's arm, you can imagine the pivot point probably being around where the shoulder joint is, because that's where the arm rotates from in real life. Chibi's front center bangs have their pivot point somewhere at the top of the image, where the hair would be attached to the scalp, theoretically. When you get to the point where you want to change the pivot point, I said point twice, oh god. If you're not sure where the pivot point should go on your layer, you can use the rotation setting under transform to try out different pivot point locations and see what feels right to you. You can also use whatever art program you used to change the origin point of the artwork and test it there. This could be useful because you might be able to see the location of the point in pixels there, and then you can transfer that to the setting in Rahituber under transform by toggling the pixels mode with this percentage button. I can't remember if I talked about that in level 1. I might have. I don't know. I'm tired. Rahituber by default uses the pivot point to calculate both the strength and the direction of rotation. When we first create a layer, the pivot point will be automatically set as the center point of the layer. So 50% down and 50% across is what we're seeing here. The strength of the rotation effect will be determined by how far the pivot point is from the layer center. When the pivot point is in the layer center, no rotation effect will be applied at all. So we'll need to move the pivot point somewhere away from the center point of the layer if we want to see any rotation. Where you place the pivot point will also determine whether we see the rotation happening backwards or forwards based on which way the layer is moving. More on that later. I will explain why that is, but it's nerds. In most cases, Rahituber knows how to make the rotation quote-unquote make sense based on the pivot point's location. Okay, you might be saying, I moved the pivot point and still nothing is happening. Well, there is another factor in making the rotation work. Rotation effect is highly connected to the drag and spring settings. And to see anything happen, you'll need to give the layer some kind of drag or spring, or both. The physics will then work together, with the rotation effect scaling with the amount of drag and or spring movement on the layer. I have more to tell you about that too, but not now. The absolute minimum knowledge you need about rotation, according to me, is that 1, the pivot point will be the point your layer rotates around. You need a pivot point set anywhere besides the layer center. 2, you need to add either a drag or spring or both. And the rotation effect value will change how strong that rotation appears to us. Once you've moved the pivot point and you've added drag or spring, you can start with a rotation effect of 1 and adjust it from there. If you feel ready to go just based on all of that, you can feel free to skip ahead to the next section, which is going to be the stretch and squash section, I think. But I'm going to continue into a deeper dive with how rotation works for those who want some extra detail. So, behind the scenes, Rahituber has some calculations happening based on real-life physics. Drag and spring, along with the actual speed or velocity of the motion the layer inherits, all have a part to play in how much acceleration there is on the child layer when it's trying to reach the ideal position, which is the parent's location. The rotation effect is based on that acceleration. The rotation effect scale is decided based on the idea of 1 being the amount of rotation that would be the most realistic amount to give based on the layer's current acceleration, and Rahituber's assumption that every layer has the same mass. But this is only actually going to be accurate when the object pictured in the layer has no empty space around it and the object isn't something that we would expect to be heavier or lighter than, I guess, the default amount. Obviously, not every layer we end up wanting on our model is going to be cropped down with no empty space, and the objects or parts of the body depicted can vary in how much they would weigh in real life. That is why we would want to change the rotation effect and test different amounts to get what we want. The actual number you'll need to achieve something that feels real would vary depending on what your layer is actually depicting, and so there isn't going to be a clear and absolute value you want for rotation effect or any of the other motion inherit settings. But like I said before, you can start with the rotation effect at 1 and then test and try out new values. That goes for any of the physics stuff. You can try changing your drag and spring and stuff as well, until you're satisfied with how the rotation looks. Stay with me, it'll be okay. This is just nerd stuff. You don't have to worry too much about that. However, if you do want to worry too much about that, I'll keep explaining. So next, we'll talk about the reason why we need drag or spring on the layer to see a rotation effect happen. And I guess without drag or spring happening, we can basically assume that the child layer's acceleration value behind the scenes is, we'll say it's 0. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but it's the minimum amount. Therefore, without either of them, setting a rotation effect will do nothing. Imagine like the rotation effect being multiplied by 0. The rotation effect scales along with the drag and spring effect, so generally you'll see the layer rotate farther with higher drag or spring values, the layer rotating the farthest when it's the most separated from the ideal position, which is the parent's location. And then it'll rotate in reverse until the physics have zeroed out on the layer, when the layer reaches that final ideal position. The spring effect will cause the layer to go past the ideal position and then behind it again, which is what can make a rotation look like it's swinging back and forth. Whereas, you know, the drag, pretty straightforward, it'll drag behind, but then settle into the position. If you have both, then you get both of these effects. The rotation is dragging behind and also springing back and forth, or swinging back and forth before it reaches that final position. And again, the amount of each is going to be a factor in how much rotation we see. So when there's none, we get 0 rotation. Let's also talk a little about the direction of the rotation effect. I want to reiterate that Rahituber's default physics calculations do a pretty good job at giving us physics that make sense according to what customizable settings we've given. The calculation for the direction of rotation, you can think of it like whether the object is rotated clockwise or counterclockwise as we move it, is based on the simulated weighted point of the layer. That is the heaviest part of the layer according to Rahituber. This is automatically calculated to be the position on the layer opposite to the pivot point. The heaviest part of the layer is the point that wants to move the slowest when applying motion. So with rotation physics applied, the rotation of our direction, the direction of our rotation is determined based on where that heavier point is. So when I say the direction of the rotation, I mean whether we're seeing it rotate kind of backwards or forwards, or clockwise, counterclockwise. However, I don't think the terms clockwise and counterclockwise are good to use because of reasons. My brain just melted. Anyway, I'm going to use forwards or backwards because that's relative to where the pivot point is. You can imagine that when using rotation or stretch and squash physics, the pivot point is the part that is leading the movement of this layer, and Rahituber is determining the direction of rotation to make it look like the heaviest part of the layer is being pulled farther away from the pivot point during movement. Usually this is going to work just fine. It's all based on how movement works in real life. But once again, things can get a little bit tricky when we want to do rotation effects on different types of layers. Ones with negative space where the object pictured isn't centered, where it isn't, fit to the layer bounds, etc. Or maybe it's something we think should have a different weight than the default that gets assigned to it.
What do you mean?
They're both a kilogram.
But steel's heavier than feathers.
I know, but they're both a kilogram.
What? But steel's heavier than feathers.
Or maybe we just don't want the most realistic physics on it. We can get more hands-on with it through the Ignore Pivots update we got in 13.5 with weight direction. This powerful little box will let you manually set the weighted part of the layer rather than just letting Rahituber calculate it based on the pivot point. I'm going to cover this a little more after we talk about stretch physics because the relationship between those physics and the layer's weight direction is even more noticeable in my opinion. And in level 3, I plan to have a whole section dedicated to the more practical implementations I found while experimenting. If you want to figure this out for yourself, though, you can refer to Rahisaurus's explanation and diagram on the 13.5 update page, which will go over Rahituber's default calculations, what I've basically just talked about, as well as what happens when you use Ignore Pivots. Another quick note to make, you can reverse the rotation direction yourself without touching anything pivot related by entering a negative value for a rotation effect. In older versions of Rahituber, there was a bug that actually made the rotation direction go in the wrong way based on physics. So for that reason, in my older builds, a lot of my layers actually had a negative rotation effect. I never realized that there was a bug, but I found it interesting that negative values were what made sense to my eyeballs. There is a setting in the advanced settings menu called Disable Rotation Effect Fix that reverts Rahituber's rotation calculations back to that old method, but it only really exists for people who set up their models before version 13.4 and didn't want the fix to mess up their builds. So unless you're here to work on an old layer set of yours, I recommend leaving it alone. If you're seeing me enter negative values here throughout the tutorial in a clip and I'm not really saying anything about it, there's a good chance it's actually past KIP you're looking at, and so just imagine they're not negative values instead. Since then, I've fixed all of my layers, so anything you're seeing from present and future KIP will have the fix applied, unless I'm using a really old model. This one's one of the new ones, though. Actually, the newest one that I made after I accidentally killed all of them. Oh god, have I confused you enough yet? Have I overloaded your brain? Well, I did say you can skip ahead to the stretch section if you wanted to, so that's on you. Just kidding. I know that all of this might sound like a lot, especially if you're a beginner to this stuff. The important parts of rotation to remember, even if you delete the rest of it from your brain, this is what I want you to remember. It's still the same as before. Your pivot point is what you rotate around, and you need to move it off of the layer center to see any rotation effect. And you need some kind of drag or spring to see anything happen as well. I also want you to remember that you can start with a rotation effect of 1 and then continue adjusting it and testing the physics until it looks right to you. With those things in combination, you should be able to start seeing rotation do things. But now I've also provided some answers as to why the rotation effect behaves the way it does, so you aren't completely lost when you try to lock in and fine-tune your physics. Man, I just yapped and recorded this whole section. Or didn't record this whole section. I just yapped through the whole thing and didn't realize I wasn't recording. This new version of this model doesn't have my angry face, but imagine I'm making an angry face. Angry. Angry. I'm angry. Stop smiling. I'm angry. Anyway, let's talk about something fun now that I've deep fried your brain. Stretch and squash. Yippee! If I could say the words right. The version 13.4 update added this for us, and I have not shut up about it since. Really, seriously. At every opportunity, I'm squishing my shit. I'm stretching my shit. Who wrote this script? Can I not think of a better way to say that? Anyway, if you got any knowledge of animation at all, the principles of stretch and squash might be familiar to you already. It's a hugely important part of many types of animation as it adds elasticity and flexibility to the object, making it feel more lively and real, which is something great to have when trying to animate things in the 2D space. For some of you, I'm not naming names, you might be very familiar with squash and stretch physics because an example of how it's applied in action would be something like... Anyway, let's go. We stretching and squashing and squatching. This stretch setting... The stretch setting in Rahituber's motion inherit settings is for both stretch and squash. I use both terms when talking about stretch physics depending on what I think the visual effect looks like, but know that I'm always actually talking about the stretch settings right here. The first thing we will want to do is change the drop down from none to either linear or preserve volume. I mostly use preserve volume in my builds, and we'll talk about why later, but we're starting in linear mode for my demonstration of the settings first so I can show you what they look like more directly. So, notice how nothing is happening yet? Can you guess why? Yeah, so there's a pattern here. We need drag or spring applied to this layer to get this type of physics as well. Like the rotation effect, stretch is very tied to the drag and spring settings because it also behaves based on the acceleration of the child layer, but if that sounds confusing to you, then ignore me. As soon as I've added some drag, we're seeing something with these default settings, and even with the pivot point in the center of the layer, you can see the stretch sort of working. I'm going to actually move the pivot point off center though, because I think it makes things clearer, and we'll talk more about the pivot point in a little bit. First, we'll return to the drop down and talk about these. Linear will restrict the vertical stretch to vertical inherited motion only, and the horizontal stretch will be restricted to when we move the layer horizontally. My main model looks janky when I do this. A little bit extreme on the settings, aren't we? I have so much editing to do. Preserve volume lets the vertical stretch have a horizontal stretch happening as well, and the horizontal stretch will squash the layer down vertically slightly. In most cases, preserve volume will look more realistic, but we're sticking with linear just for now. Like most of the other similar menus we've seen, the left column represents horizontal settings and the right column represents vertical settings. The stretch strength setting is pretty straightforward. It's the amount of stretch we see along each respective axis. Changing the stretch on the horizontal side will increase how much stretch we should see when moving horizontally, and the same goes for the vertical stretch strength. The maximum amount on the slider is 2, and the minimum is -2. Negative values here will switch the stretch to squash and vice versa. I'm dialing it up by manually entering a high number in order to demonstrate. I'm going to use like 5. If you watch the nerdy info dump part of the rotation effects section, you might be wondering now if this is similar to the rotation effects setting in how it works. And the answer is yes, I think so. As in, this number is not an absolute value of any kind. It's not a percentage. It's not units. The amount of stretch we end up seeing will also involve the acceleration of the child layer. So it scales with things like drag and spring and the speed of the movement, etc. The minimum scale is by default set to 0.5, and in this case, I think these numbers do represent a fraction or a percentage of sorts. A minimum size of 0.5 would mean that the smallest we can squash this layer down to is half its width or height along whichever axis we're looking at. You know, height for vertical, width for horizontal. You probably know. You probably know that. Maximum scale is pretty straightforward too, with the default being set to the max slider amount of 2. From what I've observed, this 2 does mean it's doubling the layer's width or height whenever we get the maximum stretch effect. We don't necessarily reach that minimum or maximum whenever we do the stretch and squashing. It depends on how much the layer can stretch or squash, which is determined by a combination of the stretch strength settings. Oh my gosh, some of these freaking words to get stretch strength. The stretch strength settings, as well as a few other things, like the other physics on the layer and the speed of the motion the layer is inheriting. Yeah, it's acceleration related again, but you can use these settings to customize what the stretch looks like by restricting or increasing how tall or wide the layer can get. You don't have to move the pivot point to see something happening with stretch, but you will probably end up wanting to move it to get the stretch and squash you're envisioning, because the pivot point is the point the layer stretches from and squashes into. When it's in the default position, the layer center, the layer is stretched equally in both directions along whichever axis, vertical or horizontal, that matches our movement. With the pivot in the center, we don't see a squash at all. But as soon as we move the pivot point, we start to see that moving the layer in one direction will cause a stretch, and when moving in the opposite direction, the layer will squash. This is because Rahituber uses the pivot point's location to decide the weight of the layer, and squash and stretch will interact with the balance, I guess, the weight balance of the layer. When it's in the middle, it's balanced, so the stretch happens equally on every side versus when it's slightly askew, then we get stretch and squash happening. Flashback to my nerdy explanation of rotation effect. Rahituber is using the pivot point to calculate the weight of the layer. By default, that point is the point on the layer that is opposite to the pivot point. The weighted point of the layer is meant to be the slowest moving. It's dragged behind the movement of the pivot point, and it becomes easier to actually see that as we have stretch and squash happening in high numbers. Lastly, let's switch to preserve volume and watch what the difference looks like. Earlier, I mentioned that preserve volume allows the vertical and horizontal stretch to affect each other. I want to note that the minimum and maximum size will actually also still apply here. So for example, if I set the horizontal stretch to a minimum size of 1, even with preserve volume on, we don't get horizontal squashing anymore. That's because I've said that the horizontal stretch, the horizontal squash can't make the layer squash any more than its original width. When I was first trying out squash and stretch, I didn't understand any of this stuff and accidentally discovered some interesting effects. For example, I created some demons by making the minimum scale higher than 1 or the maximum scale less than 1. Applying these to base layers that have everything else chained to them was especially funny because all of the physics throughout every layer react to the displacement I caused with the stretch on the parent layers. And when it's stacked with all of the other physics, I got some crazy effects. Crazy effects. Squash and stretch can be implemented in many other ways other than, you know, even just a very slight amount on a base layer somewhere, I've noticed will add liveliness and visual interest to the rest of the model, especially when adding a spring effect to go along with it. I also use a lot of stretch stuff on my hair layers to get things looking properly bouncy. Slow it down, make it bounce. Kippy Cringe Devil's kind of dying because this is the third time I've gone to record and forgotten to push the button. So I'm just yapping to myself in my room, basically about this stuff, which, you know, in a way it's good practice, but I also think I'm like slowly dying. I'm frying my own brain. Anyway, we're talking about ignore pivots, aka weight direction now. AKA, I don't know why I said it like that. Yes. I actually did elaborate about this more than I expected to when I yapped in the rotation effects section, so maybe this doesn't need much of its own section. I'm still doing it though, because there's one thing I haven't emphasized enough yet that I feel like I should. Listen to me. Okay, listen. You're gonna have to come close. Come closer. Come closer. Listen. Ignore pivot won't actually make the pivot point useless to you. It's not a setting to enable you to ignore the pivot. It's actually just talking to Rahituber. You're telling Rahituber to ignore the pivot point's relative location on the layer when it wants to calculate the weight of the layer. Meaning, Rahi won't use the pivot point to decide the direction and the strength of the rotation anymore. And it won't use the pivot point to decide which movement direction will result in a stretch or a squash when doing stretch physics, which it does normally. The pivot point will still always be the point that the layer will rotate around and the point that stretch physics will stretch the layer out from or squash into. That's very important. But you can skip the rest of this part now if you want to, because I think that's basically all you need to know for this level. However, I'm gonna keep yapping. I'm sure I sound like a broken record by now, but I will repeat that for the most part, letting Rahituber calculate the weighted point of your layer as the point opposite to the pivot probably will work just fine because that does make sense in most cases. But using the weight direction grid allows you to pick a new weighted point along the edges of the layer or in the center, and that will usually have a pretty significant effect on what your rotation and stretch physics are actually doing. This concept is difficult to simplify and summarize. It's inherently kind of complex. So again, if you're confused now, you can skip this. But to try to summarize in my words that might not be fully correct. God, I'm not a physics expert. But the weighted point of the layer is meant to be the part whose movement is dragged away from the layer's inherited movement. And that affects whether the rotation happens to look like it's going in a forward or a backward motion. as well as which part of the layer is the most stretched out behind or squashed in toward the pivot point as it moves. So changing the weighted point does some real tricky stuff by letting you manually choose in which direction your layer's physics will apply based on the direction of movement you're giving the layer. So that probably didn't make sense, but an example, by swapping the weighted point from the bottom center to the top center, I can decide that when I move the layer up, the layer will squash towards the pivot point instead of stretching from it, as opposed to the default behavior when the pivot point is up at the top of the layer, which causes the stretch to happen when I'm moving up. So see, I'm gonna choose a new weighted point, even though this one isn't opposite to the pivot point, and so in some cases makes less sense. Or seeing that when I move the layer up, now the squash is happening instead of the stretch. So yeah, you can use this to have a lot more control over what the physics look like. I can use it to adjust the weighted point and change whether horizontal motion I'm giving the layer will make the layer rotate, or if it should only rotate when I move vertically, and vice versa. And it's all just based on like the simulated quote unquote heavy part of the layer. But by combining that with pivot point, you get a lot of control. I like having this amount of control, especially when dealing with stacked setups where the physics are all interacting with each other, and I might need some of the child layers to behave a little differently than they would be expected to. But to really dig in and apply this stuff, it does take some thinking about how you really want that layer to move, and lots of experimentation. I still get very lost in the sauce sometimes when I'm doing this stuff. Well, luckily, if you're ever confused, it's easy enough to just turn off ignore pivots and go back to letting Rahituber figure it out. And in your builds, again, you can probably get decent results without worrying about it at all, if you want to. However, if you're running into something where you're like, I can't make this layer move the way that I want it to with rotation and stretch, I don't know, you could try experimenting with the weight direction. See if you can adjust the weight direction in the pivot point enough to get that looking the way you want. So technically speaking, at this point, I've given you all of the base knowledge you need about physics to be able to make what I've made. However, I think a big aspect of setting up like a complicated layer set like this, a lot of it has to do with how these things actually interact with each other. And I've touched on that a little bit throughout these different sections when I'm talking about, rotation needs a drag and spring in order to happen. And some of them increase the effects of the other physics and stuff like that. And it's very clear that you can get all kinds of different effects by combining the physics in different amounts with the movement that you put into the parent layers. So individual motion, mouse tracking, or other physics that it's inheriting. We also know that motion inherit physics are only available on a layer that we've given a motion inherit parent already, and that any motion in physics on the parent layer will affect all of the physics we set up throughout the whole chain of motion inherit parents and children. To talk about each combination of physics you can get and the resulting effects would take too long, I fear, but you can find examples in everything we've covered so far. One thing I haven't really talked about yet in the other sections is how delay interacts with other physics settings, and that's because it kind of doesn't. And by that, I mean, it doesn't have a direct relationship with the strength of the other settings. Like drag and spring and rotation and stretch all kind of affect each other in that way. But what it does do is it stops the layer from applying any kind of inherited motion until the delay passes, as well as its own physics. So the inherited motion only happens after that delay passes, and then all of the other physics will react to it. But delay doesn't count as something that increases or decreases the other effects. So that's why I haven't mentioned it too much in terms of how it combines. But specifically for me, I use delay in small amounts in some of my layers in order to help the movements look more animated, connected, and smooth. It kind of helps with the idea that some motion on the parent layers are things that the child layers react to. In real life, you can see some of that happening or something like that. I don't know. Again, that's kind of like actual physics stuff, and I'm not a physician. Is that the word? Isn't physician like a doctor? So what happens when we start to weave more motion inputs into the whole thing? What's happening to a child layer when we enable individual motion on it when there's physics going on already? What if I want to add mouse tracking to a child layer? Well, to put it simply, a child's motion inherit physics will only apply to motion it's inheriting. It's in the name, baby. So when we add individual motion on the same layer or mouse tracking, that motion input will not affect or be affected by the child's own motion inherit physics. So for example, if I add idle motion to a layer, the physics I set up here will have nothing to do with the idle motion. They don't even notice that the other exists. The same rule applies to talking motion, constant motion, mouse tracking. So if I say motion input, that's generally what I'm talking about. If I add a different type of motion input on the parent layer here, just to demonstrate the difference, I'm going to use mouse tracking on the parent layer for this. We can watch and see that the mouse tracking motion from the parent layer does work along with the child's physics. So, you know, when I'm moving the mouse, we see rotation, and rotation happening pretty strongly because I have the child's physics set to like 5. While the child's own individual motion, this idle, despite the fact that I have the idle moving it a whole lot, doesn't cause the rotation physics to happen at all. But if this same layer is the motion inherit parent of another layer, that second layer, we can call it like a grandchild if we want to, though that feels kind of silly. The grandchild now inherits that idle motion that we just set up on its parent, as well as all of the motion inherit physics starting from that first parent. So the mouse tracking from the parent and then the idle motion on the child are passed to the grandchild. If we give physics to this grandchild layer now, those physics will happen in reaction to all of the other movement that we're inheriting. And so on and so forth. If we're stacking all of these physics together, eventually the layers at the bottom of the chain will have movements based on all of the layers that came before it. And as you can imagine, as you start adding physics throughout this chain, you could eventually get some movements that are a little extreme, and it might feel a little bit out of control to you. In order to get physics working together in a way that feels nice to use, you'll most likely need to go back and forth through your layers and adjust their settings. Often I end up needing to go back and decrease the strengths of some of the movements of my base parent layers so that the child layers physics don't look so extreme. Really, just the fact that Rahituber lets me do that, though, is one of the biggest reasons why I love using it. Like, having the ability to fine-tune my physics so directly, I can increment each setting by like a decimal amount if I want to, just to get the movement happening in the way that feels right. But when I have a gajillion layers, it takes me a long time. You might be scared to start experimenting. Chaining physics throughout a multi-layer setup like this on top of worrying about the motion that you're putting into the model with talking and mouse tracking or whatever you're trying to do, it definitely sounds scary. As familiar as I've become with the process, I still get, well, lost in the sauce. But hear me out here. You don't have to make it that complicated to get a cool result. Find a base layer in your setup, or, you know, a parent layer with children and grandchildren layers. I recommend for this experiment, try like a minimum of 4 layers. I don't know. And start by adding some kind of motion input that you can control on the parent. The talking loudness setting might be a good start. Then find the first child layer that has this layer as its parent and start by adding one physics effect. You can start with something like delay, drag, or spring, which are all effects that you can use in isolation, as long as your distance limit stays at -1. Set it to whatever amount gives you an effect that you can see. I could probably go less or more if I want, but I'm going to stick right there. You can do this in extreme amounts if you want to experiment with, but it might be more clear to see what's happening if you use settings in the mid-range. Once you can see something happening, go to the next layer down in your chain. Find a layer that uses this current layer as a parent. So we're going to go find the grandchild, I guess. Add the same type of physics, though you're welcome to experiment with the other kinds if you want. with, again, whatever amount causes you to be able to see the physics effect on this layer. If you have more layers chained from here, try doing the same thing. Go through and add just a bit of physics to watch what happens to each one as you go down the chain. Then, if you want, you can go back up to the first child layer that has motion inherent physics, the one that we started with after giving individual motion to the parent, and add a second type of physics, like I'm going to add some spring. I started with drag on everything, and now I'm starting to add spring to see what happens. At this point is when I would start experimenting on child layers by enabling individual motion on them and watching how their individual motion looks when in combination with the inherited motion. I'll start trying different types of physics on child layers too, things like rotation physics and stretch, which I can customize further by adjusting the pivot point. And if I continue with this, I'm going to get lost in the sauce again. So you get the idea. I'll wrap that up right there, and we'll head into the outro of this section. Unfortunately, I don't have a strict rule or guide for you to follow for how you should set all of this up. Again, for sure, I've been a broken record with this, but I cannot emphasize it enough. Your setup could look very different based on what your avatar is portraying and how you want it to move. As Rahituber has gained some attention and I've been able to see what people are cooking, I've noticed that a lot of users have designs and avatars that they're working on that they don't look anything like mine. Some of them aren't even human shaped, like Nyx Helix recently cooked up a Rahituber build for his TTS mascot, shape-shifting slime, and JCN, who gave us a tutorial on using audio outputs as inputs, by the way, which you should check out because it's very cool. JCN has like an animal mascot that reacts to music. I'm so sorry, I forget what game it's from, but I know it's from a game. I've actually even built an entire scene in Rahituber before. And yeah, there are physics happening in here, and individual motion as well. Really, it's just so beautiful. It's amazing that Rahituber can work for so many types of builds. When you can at least somewhat understand what's actually happening with the physics, then you can start to think about how to use them in interesting ways. It's an amazing tool to help PNGtubers or anyone really apply their creativity, and it makes me so excited for the future. I want to see how you guys get absolutely wild with this. Of course, though, most of this tutorial was meant to teach you how to end up with a model that looks like the chibi one. It was supposed to be kind of directly a how to make this tutorial, but it has evolved into something else as I realized how important it is to be like subjective with these things. You know what I mean? I can't give you the exact numbers you need because it's not going to work. I have made sure, though, in this section to cover any physics-related technique or idea that I know I've applied when making this and making my main model. The tricks that I've been showing off on social media and in various clips mainly have to do with the mouse tracking. Like that's the real devious, clever, tricky stuff that I'm doing and that's actually what I consider the more elaborate part of my setup. That's why it's unfortunately going to be covered in level 3 and not here. The physics that I'm using, it's all just what I've talked about today. It's a little bit of drag, a little bit of spring, and a little bit of rotation. And nowadays I've been adding like squash, and it does get more complicated when I'm messing with weight direction. But even before I touched something like ignore pivots and weight direction, I had really cool effects going on the model without needing to worry about it. Rahi has built Rahituber in such a way that unless you're really trying to dig your paws in and mess around, it's going to give you results that should make sense based on real life physics. But, you know, I'm trying to teach you how to mess around. So, anyway, I can't spend too much time showing direct examples of the physics settings on this or my other models, but I'm happy to show off any settings if you ever catch me live. As long as I'm not supposed to be paying attention in a collab and yapping through my death instead. Shout out to the repo stream. Anywho, with the chunkiest part of the tutorial out of the way and my voice dying from all of this yapping, let's talk about something a little less brain hurty next. States. Woohoo! Let's make some toggles. We're actually visiting past Kip for the next part of the video because that part is not something I need to re-record. Anyway, goodbye.
Hey, what was all that about? Patty the platypus!
So the next thing I did to make this model a bit more immersive was I added a few states. So We'll talk a little bit about that. So I kind of forgot to, so I'm recording this after, but we're going to start with the easiest type of toggle, which is simply showing and hiding a layer when a key or button is pushed. In this example, I'll be adding a clown nose to the model. So once I've set up the layer, the clown nose layer, with the physics that I wanted, if I want any, I made the layer hidden by default. I then opened up the states menu. You get this floating menu that you can drag around, scroll, and resize as you please. We have some settings up here, but they won't make too much sense until we see the rest of the settings, so we'll circle back to them at the end. When I click this add button, we have a new state added. We have the state's name, which you can set by clicking the pencil button, just like a layer. This checkbox is how you disable or enable the state. If you have the HTTP requests toggle on in advanced settings, you'll get this section here, and you'll be able to see the index number here to the left of the name. We won't be getting into HTTP requests until level 3 in States Part 2, but to recap, this is how you would use webhooks sent from your stream manager, in my case I use StreamerBot, to be able to more directly toggle these states rather than having to use a hotkey or a button. If you're looking for how to do that, skip to level 3, States Part 2. This little button here, click to record key, is where we set the key, mouse button, or controller input that will toggle this state. Clear will clear that, so you can remove the key you've set previously. Active type, we have access to a toggle mode, while held, and permanent. We'll talk about while held just a little bit further in this section when I show you my blinking state. Permanent is something I've never used, but it will have pretty much the effect you can expect. After being triggered, the state remains active permanently, from my understanding, until you reload the model. Our clown nose will be set to toggle, so we can toggle it on and off with the hotkey we set ourselves. I'm going to set it to my numpad / key, just an easy one to test for now. The can trigger section here, we will keep it on always, but we can change this to either while talking or while idle if we want to. We'll be covering a simple type of state for while talking when I show you my arm up state later in this section. And I'll show off a more complex application of the while talking type of state in level 3 States Part 2 when I'm talking about mouth shapes, alternate mouth shapes for talking. The timeout setting, this sets how long the state can be active before it times out in seconds. I kept it on the default value of 5 just while we're testing, but for a redeem I might make it 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, etc. by manually entering the number here. Schedule. Toggling this setting will give us access to 2 more settings, interval and variation. I'll talk about randomized states in all of the other examples in this section, blinking, arm up, and eye contact. But the TLDR is that these settings allow us to make the state trigger on its own, and we can adjust how frequently and whether it's on a rigid schedule or random using those 2 settings. In this section where we see all of our layers' names is where the magic happens. In this example, it's super straightforward. We'll go find our clown nose layer and tell the state to show it. Every other layer can be kept as no change since the state shouldn't affect anything else. If we wanted to expand this into a redeem that does more than just give us a clown nose, let's say if I wanted a clown wig put on, I don't have one, but I might eventually. I would find my hair layers and choose hide for all of them. Then I would click show for the wig. That'll then hide the hair layers and show the wig layer. Now to touch on the settings at the top of the states window before we move on. States pass through essentially makes it so that you can trigger multiple states using the same hotkey if you want. Hide no change will clean up the UI when you're looking at these layers and only show you the layers currently affected by the state you have expanded. Ignore joystick axis only matters if you're using a controller for your states. Having it on means that your controller's joystick movement won't be read by the software as an eligible trigger for a state. I believe this is available for compatibility reasons with different types of controllers. I haven't ran into that problem myself though. Because we're able to use controller inputs to trigger states, that means that you'd be able to use a controller on your model, where if you positioned the model's thumbs in a certain way, you could pretty much accurately be pushing the buttons IRL and in the art. The same could apply for a mouse, or a keyboard for that matter, if you're adventurous enough to add assets for those things to your setup. I haven't done anything like that yet, but I'd love to give my avatars an accurate controller eventually, and I am crazy enough to rig a whole keyboard. So now we're going to get into my blinking state, which I'll use as a demonstration to talk about scheduling and random intervals. as well as touching on the while held active type and talking about using a parent layer to hide a bunch of layers at once more easily. I also thought it would be helpful to explain how I get a multi-layer setup for the eyes working with blinking and why I chose to do the blinking the way I did, which is using a state rather than any of the built-in blinking on any of the eye layers. This is a slightly more complex level of states, but not quite as advanced as we're going to get into in the states part 2 part of the video much later. The eye layers were set up in a specific way. The irises, the mask, and the lashes were all set to inherit motion from this eyes default whites layer. I actually, in later versions, labeled this eyes parent so I can see that better. All of these other iris layers that I made, these alternate ones like these eye contact irises, and some of these other versions of the iris, which I won't get into because it involves mouse tracking stuff and we're not there yet. So if I toggle on the eyes closed layer that I have for you, you can see that the eyes closed that I drew doesn't completely fill in the space where the eyes live, and you can see the rest of the eyes poking through when my eyes are closed. So the reason why I didn't use the built-in blinking for any of these is because they won't follow the same cycle. Even if they're set to the same settings for blinking, the different eye layers won't follow the same blinking cycle. The layers would blink at different times, and then we would see any of the other eye layers poking through, and it would look super messed up. So how did I solve that problem? Well, in my main model, it's set up in a really similar way where the eyes are separated, the irises are on their own layer so I can track them. And for that model, my solution was just to paint extra space, extra skin around the closed eyes, set that as the blinking sprite for the top layer in my eyes folder, so my eyelashes. So then on that layer's blinking cycle, it didn't matter what's going on underneath. All of the eye layers are covered up by that blinking sprite. When I had reached this point on stream, I realized I had this problem again, and I voiced something about not wanting to draw more, at which point Rahi actually suggested using a state instead. I added a state and called it blink. I have it on toggle, and I had it set to a timeout of 0.2 seconds, so we only blink for a very short time. It can trigger anytime. I have it set to a schedule. In this example, the state will toggle every 4.2 seconds. I set the variation to 4.2, the same number as the interval, because I thought it could be a little funny if we could either like blink super rapidly or have a really long blink if it triggers after 0 seconds, while it can still be a pretty long time between blinks as well. I can actually change this to while held, and the schedule will still apply, but I can also hold it down. And I can then do this kind of rapid. So I have recently been using this because I think it's funny. Now we have to actually tell the state what to do when it's toggled. When this state is toggled, we're going to show the eyes closed layer that I have, which is hidden by default. So in here, when the state is not toggled, right here, you can see it's not visible. As soon as this state comes on, it becomes visible. And in order to hide the rest of the layers, you'll notice I didn't actually touch them here. I didn't say to hide the lashes, the mask, and the irises. Instead, I just hid the parent. And to explain to you why I did that, besides just the fact that it looks neater, is because if I chose to just hide every other eye layer manually instead, if I'm doing stuff with toggles and expressions later where I want to make more eye layers, and they need to also listen to this blink state, I'd have to go back in, edit the state, and hide any new layers that I've just added. Doing it this way will work as long as all of my eye layers inherit motion from the eye's parent, and as long as they have hide with parent toggled on. If I did not have this toggled, you can see right away when I'm blinking, the eyelashes layer that I'm on stays visible. When I have it turned on, as soon as I blink, this is hidden. We'll be talking more about toggling different expressions and messing with eye and mouth layers later in the advanced portion of the tutorial in States Part 2. Then I came in here and did an arm up because I wanted an arm that would be able to come up while I'm talking and come up randomly. It's set up similarly to the blink, kind of, with the whole toggle, timeout, schedule, interval variation, just slightly different settings here. But instead of it being able to toggle always, it's only going to be able to toggle while I'm speaking, while the program thinks I'm speaking. This threshold here is similar to the talk threshold that we saw when setting up our first layers. This will change how loud you need to be in order for this to toggle. So if I had it way down, it would probably toggle a lot more often or a lot more easily, versus if I had it way up, it would almost never toggle because I'm not reaching this max volume very often. I have it set to 400. My actual like mouth layer, I believe, is set to something more like around the 0.1 mark. The reason for that is I wanted it to come on a little bit less often and only really come up when I'm speaking a bit more loudly. Yeah, I adjusted these settings a little bit. I ended up with this 2.5 timeout and a longer interval with less variation, so it doesn't come on as often, but still slightly randomly. And then in here, it was very simple. All I did was show my arm up and hand up layers and hide my arm down and hand down layers. The other easy state that I set up here was this eye contact state. Right now I don't have it set to random, so we'll do that together. I only have it set to this num7 so I can control it. It actually doesn't have a timeout this way, so I can hold eye contact for as long as I want. I think I had it set that way for tutorial's sake, but we'll change it right now. So we'll make it toggle, can trigger always, but we will set a timeout of, we'll keep it 5 seconds. And we can schedule this to be whatever, but something like the interval of about 6 seconds and variation of about 2 should make it so that we look at the camera randomly. There we go. It took a while to trigger for that time for some reason. And then in here, same kind of deal, except we did hide more layers because we couldn't get away with just hiding parent whites. We had to leave parent whites alone because the layers that we're trying to show, these eye contact layers, also share that parent. So if we decided to hide the parent layer, in this case it would actually also hide eye contact and wouldn't do what we want. We also wanted the eye mask and lashes to still be showing, so we left those alone. We only hid all of the other irises that I added. So the default eye tracking that are showing when I'm not doing anything will hide, and the eye contact will come on when this state is triggered. The eye contact layers are actually the original irises that I drew in this case. The eyes tracking layers were duplicated from there, and then I adjusted the position in transforms to make it so that they are looking towards the left. I could have changed these and had them more looking towards the center and then made eye contact a little bit more towards the right if I wanted to. Having the layers be separated gives me a lot of freedom in that regard. I played around a lot off stream with mouse tracking on the irises, even on this model. But I got a little bit ahead of myself, a little bit carried away, and did some crazy things with different eyes, different iris layers, and different types of tracking. I plan to make another video that goes more in depth into what I did there.